We are in the last of a series of messages that we've been running through the month of November. Now, I know everything about the Sunday after Thanksgiving is Christmas. I know everyone's talking about it. I know the Christmas music is on the radio stations. I know that we have just experienced Black Friday, and Cyber Monday is coming. So everything seems to be pointing toward December 25th. But let's not forget that just last Thursday, we celebrated Thanksgiving. And let's not forget that we are given this privilege of coming together and worshiping the Lord every Lord's Day and giving Him thanks and praise. And so with that, we have this series of messages that we've been looking at. This morning's message is entitled God's Training Course. And we're going to be primarily in 1 Timothy chapter 6. So I'll ask that you turn to that, hold that for that portion of the sermon in which we'll be looking at what Paul gave to Timothy as instructions for godly living. 1 Timothy chapter 6. Turn to that and hold on to it. We'll be looking at that in just a moment. This is our fourth and our final in the series of Take God at His Word, Expect a Harvest. Now, in the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes, way back before the book of Psalms, after the book of Psalms, in fact, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, had to think about its order. You find it in the Old Testament after the Psalms. Solomon wrote a book that described a journey. He never really identified himself as the person taking the journey, but most scholars and most people who have knowledge of Hebrew history say that Solomon was really writing an autobiography. He was writing about himself. What he did is he wrote about someone who followed what the world said would give him contentment and purpose. And so Solomon, having all the wealth that anyone would ever want at his disposal, pursued those things that the world said would give him wealth and contentment. But he kept coming up empty, time and time again. Ecclesiastes is a book of perspectives. The narrative of the preacher, the way the King James Version puts it, or the teacher is the way the New International Version puts it. But here's the story of a person who reveals the depression that results from seeking happiness in worldly things. That's what the whole book of Ecclesiastes is about. The book gives us as Christians a chance to see the world through the eyes of a person who, though he was very wise, was trying to find meaning for life in temporary and human things. Almost every form of worldly pleasure is explored by this preacher, and none of it gives him a sense of meaning. In fact, he says it's vanity. He says it's like trying to catch the wind. He tried scientific discovery in chapter 1. He tried wisdom and philosophy, also in chapter 1. In chapter 2, he went on to partying because everyone said that would make him happy. He went to alcohol in chapter 2. He studied architecture and built great buildings in chapter 2. He threw himself into property investments, also in chapter 2, and into luxury. He turned his mind toward different philosophies to find meaning, such as materialism. And he even pursued moral codes, the things that people say should make us right and make us feel happy. But he found that every one of these things was absolutely meaningless. It was a temporary diversion because they were without God. And when we pursue things in this life without God, there is no purpose, and there's nothing that's going to last. In the end of Ecclesiastes, the preacher came to accept that faith in God is the only way to find personal meaning and personal contentment in our lives. He decided to accept the fact that life is brief, and ultimately, life is worthless without God. But with God, we can focus on something that is eternal. And with God, we can focus on something that does not give us temporary pleasure, but gives us the deep well of satisfaction we were designed for. God has a training course. And that training course, to come to the goal of having that kind of understanding, is our life. We are in the process of training. Is your life lacking direction? The secret in finding contentment comes when we understand three things. And these three things are pointed out to us by the Apostle Paul in the book of 1 Timothy. So in 1 Timothy chapter 6, we find that Paul is saying that we need to come to an understanding that we are spiritual beings. And that's really hard to do when we live in this world. It's hard to do when everything about us is this world and is the here and now and is the physical and is the sense of satisfying not just our needs but satisfying our pleasures. But look at what Timothy was told by the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 6 in verses 17 through 19. He says this, speaking to Timothy as a young preacher, as an evangelist. He's instructing him what to do and how to treat the congregation that he's working with. He said, "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way they will lay up a treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so they may take hold of life that is true life." We think this is living. We think because we are sitting here in this building today, and because we are breathing, and because our ears are listening, and our minds are functioning, this is life. Oh, this is temporary, because we are spiritual beings. We are designed to be eternal. We are designed from the time we take our first breath of air in this world to the time we take our last to see this as very temporary and to see what God has in store for us. We are spiritual beings. We need to realize where our true life exists. Folks, our true life does not exist here. Our true life is not made up of the worldly things around us. Our true life and the satisfaction of life doesn't come from the bargains we get on Black Friday, Small Business Saturday, or Cyber Monday. No. We are created to be eternal. Every one of us will be eternal. Every one of us lives forever. The choice we have is where we live forever. And the way we make that choice is by how we live here and how we live now. The Apostle Paul compares our bodies to tents. He says our human body, it's temporary. It's just like a tent that's used for a while and then is tossed aside because there's something more eternal for you to have and to possess and to enjoy, something permanent. So, how do we discover our true life? If we are designed by God to be eternal beings, but we lose sight of that because of this temporary status we have in this life, how do we discover our true lives? Paul is very clear in chapter 6, verse 17 of 1 Timothy. He tells us that God gives us everything. God gives us everything. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. But this really doesn't mean that we will have every material thing that we hope and we wish for. Some people have taken that verse and they have mistranslated it. Instead, because God is interested in our good, God provides what we need. He provides what we need, not what we want, but what we need. Now, to help us understand why Paul is even addressing this issue, we need to go back a few verses. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 through 10, answers those who mistakenly think that following Christ will somehow make them financially prosper. Have you ever heard a preacher say that? Have you ever read a book that says that? Look at what 1 Timothy chapter 6, starting at verse 3 says. We're going to read verses 3 through 10 because this explains why verses 17, 18, and 19 are there. 1 Timothy chapter 6, starting at verse, I'll say this correctly. 1 Timothy chapter 3, I'd said it wrong again. 1 Timothy chapter 6, starting at verse 3. Listen to what Paul says. He says, if anyone teaches false doctrines and does not agree with the sound instruction of our Lord Jesus Christ and to godly teaching, he is conceited and understands nothing. He has an unhealthy interest in controversies and quarrels about words that result in envy, strife, malicious talk, evil suspicions, and constant friction between men of corrupt mind who have been robbed of the truth and who think that godliness is a means to financial gain. There were people back in the first century church who were saying, God wants you to be healthy and wealthy and prosperous, and everything the world offers you is at your disposal if you come to God. And Paul says, no. Listen to what he says in his explanation to those who would promote that kind of teaching. Verse 6, godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. People who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Doesn't that sound like what Solomon was describing in the book of Ecclesiastes? You want to be happy? You want to have real life? Here's what you do. You invest, you party, you booze it up, you flaunt yourself. Here's what you do. You build great buildings, you make a name for yourself. Here's what you do, and you'll be happy. And every time Solomon said, I did it, and it was worthless. True life cultivates contentment. If we understand that we are designed to be eternal, and we are eternal beings here in this world, living temporarily in a physical world, true life is going to cultivate contentment because we will understand that we live for someplace else, not for here. We become mature. We trust God's timing. We repent from selfish mistakes, and we learn discipline. And we are tested. Yes, we're tested. And only those worthy of trust are given more. That's what Jesus said in so many of his parables. Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful in a few things. I will let you oversee many things. Enter into the joys of your reward. You see, when we live only for this life, we're missing the mark. because we are eternal beings. And we need to understand, as eternal beings, we are spiritual beings. We have a different home and a different goal than the world has. Secondly, our lives here are really to prepare us for the next. This is the testing ground. This is where the rubber meets the road. Much of the stress that we experience in our culture comes from having more than we need rather than not having enough. Think about that. I'm talking about our Western culture. I'm talking about our United States. And I'm talking about our neighbors in Canada. Think about the mentality we have to be consumers. And much of the stress that we experience in our lives comes because we have more than we need, and more is trumpeted, and more is broadcast, and people try to convince us constantly to have more and more and more. Imagine for a moment if everything was suddenly whisked away and we became citizens of a third world country. Now that's really hard for us to do. Even for those who would be the poorest of the poor in this room, it's still hard for us to think that what would happen if we lost what we just assume is ours and we take for granted. Well, here's 9 steps that would help us understand what it would be like to live in the third world. You want to understand what it's like? First, take out the furniture in your house. Leave a few old blankets, a kitchen table, and maybe one wooden chair. You've never had a bed, remember? Second, throw out your clothes, all of them. Each person in the family may keep the oldest suit or dress, a shirt, or a blouse. The head of the family is the only one who has a pair of shoes. Third, all kitchen appliances have vanished. You keep a box of matches, a small bag of flour, some sugar and salt, a handful of onions that you've grown, a dish of dried beans, and you rescue the moldy potatoes from the garbage can because those moldy potatoes are tonight's meal. Fourth, dismantle the bathroom. Shut off the running water. Take out the wiring from your house and the lights and everything that you have that runs on electricity. Fifth, take away the house and move the family to the tool shed. Sixth, no more mail carriers, firemen, or government services. The 2-classroom school is 3 miles away, but only 2 of your 7 children can be able to attend, and they walk. Seventh, throw out your bank books, your stock certificates, pension plans, insurance policies, and now you have a cash hoard of $5. 8, get out and start cultivating your 3 acres of land. Try hard to raise $300 in cash crops because your landlord wants 1/3 of your money and he's charging you 10%. And 9th, find some way for your children to bring in a little extra cash so that you'll have something to eat most days. But it won't be enough for your family to keep their bodies healthy. So lop off 25 to 30 years of your life. Now, think about this. We cannot be people who live only for the here and now. We cannot be people who live for things. We need to live for what we were designed to live for that place where we are going to belong forever. And this world prepares us for the next. How are we doing? Are we living for God? And are we living for others? Or are we living for ourselves? Really, this leads us to the third thought, and that is the fact that the harvest is coming. The harvest is coming. There's going to be a time of accountability. There's going to be a time in which we need to tell God what we have done with the overabundance of blessings He has given us in this land and given us in our lives. True life should be intensifying our generosity. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 and in verse 18, one of those verses we read at the beginning, it emphasizes that being a Christian means we give our attention to three things. We give our attention to good works, because Paul said we need to be rich in good deeds. We give our attention to our resources. We need to be generous. And then he said we need to give our attention to gaining the right attitude. We need to be willing to share. Tell those who are rich not to put their trust in their riches, but put their trust in those three things. We cannot expect a harvest if we do not plan for a crop. How in the world can we harvest something from the ground that's never been planted? And if we are going to be harvesting for God, we need to be preparing our soil. You remember the story Jesus told, and earlier this year we took a look at the parables of Christ. Remember the story he told about the sower and the seed, and you know how the farmer went along and scattered the seed, and it landed on 4 types of soil. It was only the prepared soil where the seed sprouted and grew and produced a crop. I think sometimes that parable is more about preparing the soil than it is about casting the seed. We need to prepare the soil, because it's the good soil that receives the seed and allows that seed to go ahead and germinate and root and grow and flourish and produce more seed. Are you preparing your own soil? Are you sharing the blessings? When you've received a harvest, when you have something given to you, what are you doing with it? Are you spreading it out so it can grow again? Or are you putting it in a storehouse and keeping it only for yourselves? Keeping it in a storehouse will not generate next year's crop. It only generates selfishness. Are you watering? And are you cultivating? Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul was dealing with believers who were arguing about who their favorite preacher was. They said, you know, we've had a lot of preachers come through this church, and I really kind of like, and they would name the preacher. The guy that's there now, yeah, he's okay, but he's not like, and they would name the preacher. And Paul said, look, some of you are saying you follow me. Some of you are saying you follow Peter. Some of you are saying you follow the evangelist Apollos. Some of you are bragging and saying you don't follow men, you follow Jesus Christ. He said, look, who is Apollos and who is Peter and who am I? He said, I planted the seed. Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. So it's not the person who plants that's special, nor is it the person who waters that's special, but it's God who makes it grow. But I think it's an important point to note. If we're not watering, there's not going to be growth. If we are not doing what we need to do to help this seed grow and to help the crop produce and to help germinate and grow more Christians, where will the church be in another generation? We need to be watering the crop. We need to be preparing the soil. We need to be planting by sharing the blessings, but we need to water and cultivate. So, what is our outcome? How big will the harvest be? In that parable of the sower and the seed, Jesus said that the harvest will be 30, 60, and even 90 times what was planted. That sounds great. But let's go to the business terms here. Let's go to the terms that people would understand if they are marketing or if they are involved in investments. When Jesus said the crop will be 30, 60, and 90 times what was planted, in our modern day business terms, he is saying there is a 3,000%, a 6,000%, and a 9,000% return. Now, believe me, there's not any marketer or business person in this room or in this town that would think that that would even be feasible with our investments in these days. It is unheard of, it is unimaginable, and it is unrealistic. But we get down to the point of asking this question: really? Is anything impossible for God? And the answer is one word and two letters: no. Nothing is impossible for God. There is no promise too hard for God to fulfill. There is no prayer too hard for God to answer. There is no problem too hard for God not to solve. There is no place too hard for God not to send a revival. And there is no person too hard for God not to save. But for Him to do that, for Him to make it grow, we need to be planting. We need to be watering. In Genesis chapter 18, verse 14, the question was asked, is anything too hard for the Lord? In Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 17, there was an answer: there is nothing too hard for you. And then Jesus, in an encounter with a father who had a son who needed Jesus' healing, in Mark chapter 9, we come on this conversation. Mark 9:22. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible to him who believes. And immediately the boy's father cried out and said, I do believe. Help me in my unbelief. D.L. Moody said it as well as anyone I've ever heard or I've ever seen written down. D.L. Moody, the great preacher of the 19th century, late 19th century and early 20th century, said, God never made a promise that was too good to be true. God never made a promise that was too good to be true. If there is going to be a harvest, if we are going to be living spiritual lives, if we are going to be realizing that this life and everything about it is temporary, we need to understand that nothing is impossible for God. And we simply need to do our jobs. We need to prepare our soil. We need to scatter the seed. We need to water and cultivate. In the midst of living in a world that is full of pressure and stress and struggle, God does not leave us to fend for ourselves. Instead, He teaches us to prepare for and expect His harvests. And you know what? It's time for the church to take God at His word. It's time for us to stop listening so much to what the world says is going to make us happy and healthy and well. And it's time for us to listen to what God says when He says, live for me. It's time to listen to Jesus when He declared, my kingdom is not of this world. It's time for us to realize how temporary this is and how this is our place to prepare for our eternity. It takes some decisions. And the first decision is to follow Jesus. The first decision is let Him enter your cold, calloused, hard heart and let Him be the soft presence of love that you need. Live for Jesus. Make the determination to follow Him. Decide to obey Him, to be baptized into Him, to walk in His steps, and then to live this life with sheer joy, because what we do here is preparing us for what will last forever. Take God at his word and expect his harvest. Prepare your soil. Plant the seed. Water, cultivate, and God will make it grow. It's up to you. It's up to you to quit living like this is our end all and start looking to glory and realize that's our real home. Would you take God at his word? Would you start living your life that way today? If you're outside of Christ, if you don't know his love and grace, we invite you. For those of us who are Christians, let's get down to business. Let's quit swallowing hook, line, and sinker what the world tells us, and let's start living for eternity and having the deepest and greatest desire of bringing others with us. So there's a wonderful harvest and a bountiful crop in heaven. You can do that. You can change your mind and your heart and your attitude today by giving yourself to Jesus Christ. If you need that commitment, we invite you, whether you're already a believer and you need to rededicate your life, or whether you've never been baptized, we invite you to make that commitment today and come to Christ and to know that we live for him. Let's stand, and you can make that kind of commitment publicly today by coming forward. Let's stand together.